All right, welcome into the hot shop, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. If you have a hard time hearing me because the hot shop can be kind of loud sometimes, I have closed captioning up on the screen, so that's really helpful. But just to start us all off, has anyone been to the Museum of Glass before? So a few of you have been to the hot shop before, but just in case someone hasn't been in the hot shop before, I'm just going to give a little rundown as to how hot some of these furnaces are, just to start us off. So I'll point out this furnace that they're using over on the right here. You can see Levi has this long pipe inside of that closed door. This is where we're getting all of our molten glass. And as you can see, it's very viscous and sticky, a lot like honey. This is because we heated that glass up to about 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's over 4 times the heat of your oven at home, just to give you a little comparison. And then these open face furnaces that we have, these are for reheating only. So these run between 21 and 2300 degrees Fahrenheit. So just a little bit hotter than that freshly gathered glass. So over on the right side of the hot shop specifically, Levi has that glass on the end of his pipe, and inside of that glass we actually do have a bubble, so this is going to be blown out even further and turned into a cylinder. And just then they were rolling the glass into some frit, F-R-I-T. These are little shards of colored glass, and in this case it's just clear glass shards. They're rolling it into the surface to give the piece some texture. And then over on that left side of the hot shop, they're just working on finishing up a project. They're gathering some glass over and over again on a small pipe, and then just adding a little bit of blue color onto that glass before turning it into a little medallion. So they're just using a brass stamp, and this is creating that almost like a cookie shape. And just in case anyone didn't know, if anyone ever has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll come right over. I've already been doing that a couple of times here, but just for those who didn't know. So inside of that bowl on the screen, we have either a glass powder or a glass frit, which I described earlier as those little shards of glass. And so they could come in a bunch of different colors you could see up on the screen. And when we roll the glass inside of that frit, it almost gives the piece a speckled appearance. So that's how they're getting texture and color for some pieces. So glass has, well, this specific glass that we're using right now anyways, has a melting point of around 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. But metal has a much higher melting point depending on the kind of metal it is. So steel is going to melt at a much higher temperature than that. Therefore, if we have glass touching steel, it's not going to melt the steel. So the building that we're inside of, interestingly enough, is actually mostly for aesthetic purposes. It's based off of these old wood burners we used to have along this Theophos waterway here, called wigwam burners or beehive burners. And they were shaped just like this cone that we're inside of. I'm sure they were a little bit smaller. You can see a photo of them up on the screen here. This cone is about 90 feet tall, they told me, I think. And it's just to pay tribute to what this area used to be used for. And at the center bench here, you can see that Gabe has heated up a piece of color that started off kind of like this in my hand here. And he's going to drop that little bit of melted color onto a small clear bubble. And this process is called a color drop or color overlay. It's going to give us a really smooth, even layer of color across our entire piece. You remember the texture of the frit is kind of like sand, and it's going to leave speckles across our piece. Well, this is the way that we just get a really smooth surface of color across the piece. So the colors themselves inside of the glass come from different metals mixed into the glass. So just to give you an example, cobalt mixed into glass will create blue glass, cobalt blue. And another example might be gold chloride. And so the glass starts off in a colored form, shipped in from a factory or a place that makes it, and then we just use that colored glass. So on the right side of the hot shop, once again, Levi is creating some large cylinders of glass. And these are eventually going to be used for light fixtures. They're going to cut off the bottom and possibly the top of the cylinder, and it's just going to be a hollow tube shape. They're going to be able to use this as basically a light cover, kind of like putting a light inside of that glass. So over on the right now, they're using this wooden board with a stack of newspapers over top of it. This is all soaked in water to help prevent that wood from burning. And they're going to use this to apply even pressure along the entire piece of glass at the same time. This is going to give us really straight, even walls for our cylinder. And at the center bench, you can see we finished rolling that color back. You can see how it's completely covering the bubble that we used to have. And that bubble is still inside of that color. Later on, we're going to be blowing more and expanding that bubble inside to create a bigger piece. And if I didn't mention it already, this piece at the center bench is eventually going to turn into a pitcher, like a water pitcher. And these are specifically called pineapple pitchers because we're going to be using a special mold that gives us these little air bubbles all throughout the inside of the glass. And I'll make sure to point that out as soon as they start using it. So whenever we're finished with the glass piece, we let it cool down to around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And that may sound like it's still pretty hot, but at that point, the glass is actually hardened and is pretty much as solid as any other glass. And so from there, we set it aside in our annealer, which is the large black box over on the left and right hot shop walls. And inside of that box, it stays at 950 degrees Fahrenheit and then slowly, slowly, slowly cools down at least overnight. So it's a long process, and we usually don't see the piece until the next day. So I actually get that question a lot from many different people about these torches that we have lit at each station usually. And these, I just call them large fluffy flames because they're pretty soft on the glass. But we keep them constantly lit just so that if we suddenly need to heat something up, then we can just grab it anytime we need it. We don't have to go through the process of picking up a smaller torch and then reigniting it. So the glass is inside of that large tank with the closed door, and this is staying at a pretty steady 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. Oh, and I just wanted to point out real quick, up on the screen, you could see Sarah blowing into that mold. And I'll make sure to show you a picture of that mold in just a moment. And then these open face furnaces at each bench, these are running between 21 and 2300 degrees Fahrenheit. And that large torch that I mentioned, this is running around that same temperature as well, just so that we can heat up the glass in specific areas rather than the entire glass overall. Now, could I have a picture of that pineapple mold, please? So up on the screen, I just wanted to point this picture out real quick. So this is an example of the pineapple mold, and these are why these pitchers are called pineapple pitchers, is because we're using this mold to get all these little air bubbles inside of the glass. So they just stuffed the glass inside of that mold, and now we have a bunch of dimples, little holes across the surface of our glass. Then when we gather, one more layer of glasses is going to trap air inside of each of those individual holes, creating bubbles. And you'll notice after each time we get new glass, or after we do something like stuffing it inside of a mold here, we make sure to let that glass cool down to probably around 1000 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, and then they're going to gather another layer over top of that. We don't want the glass to be moving around very much before we go into that clear glass furnace. We don't want to lose the shape of what we already have. And whenever you see them gather and then allow some of that glass to drip back off, this is called a strip gather. And this is just giving them a partial layer of that clear. In this case, they just wanted to cover up those dimples to trap air bubbles. They didn't really need to gather a lot of mass. So all of our clear glass can actually be reused. So next to the furnace, we have a specific clear bucket that they will drip the glass into, and we can basically just break that apart and put it back into the furnace to melt down again later on. And if it had color in it, sadly, we cannot reuse that because the color is kind of diluted within the rest of the glass, which is usually clear. and it just wouldn't really be good to reuse. And we can't throw it into the clear glass mixture too, because this would just add color to the clear and kind of taint the rest of that tank. So any paper or wood that we use in the hot shop does slowly burn over time, but usually we apply water to it and it burns a lot slower. But it's really important that we use wood in the hot shop because it's an insulating material. So a way that you could think about this is if you sit on a wooden bench, it's just going to feel kind of neutral temperature. If you sit on a metal bench, it feels cold because it's actually pulling the heat out of you. So when we touch a metal tool to hot glass, it's going to pull the heat out of the glass. When we touch a wood tool to hot glass, it's not going to do that. So the furnaces run off of natural gas and forced air, but our torches actually run off of propane and oxygen. And at the center bench here, you can see that they're hanging this bubble down towards the ground at an angle. And this is actually them using gravity as another one of their tools. So this is stretching that glass out, creating a longer, kind of narrower shape usually. And right now, Gabe is going in with two metal blades called the jacks. These are really important because they create something called the jack line, which is this divot they've created near the pipe. And this is where we remove this piece from the pipe in just a little bit. And they make these pineapple pitchers pretty frequently. These are made for the Museum of Glass store, so these are pretty fast process. So if the glass is hot and it falls on the floor, this is going to kind of slowly move, kind of like putty or taffy. But if it's hard when it falls on the floor, it's just going to break as if it were normal glass. Yeah, so something interesting about glass is when it's hot, a lot of you notice it's glowing orange. And I like to compare this to lava. So no matter what color it is, it's going to be glowing this bright orange when it's hot. And then as it slowly cools down, this is going to show more and more of that true color. In this case, it looks like we might be working with purple at the center bench or maybe a lavender color. So sometimes they'll use a different furnace just based on where they need to go. But there's not really a difference between the furnaces themselves, I'll point out. And at the center bench, they just did a really important process, which is attaching a second pipe to the bottom. The second pipe that they attach to a piece is called the punty, and this is just to get access to the other side of the piece. So now you can see we have access to the top of our pitcher now, and we can start to open this up a little bit. And just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll come right over. Once again, we have Levi Belber over on the right bench, and he and his team are creating some large cylinders, and these are eventually going to be used as light fixtures. They're going to be cutting the bottom of the cylinder off, so it's basically just a large tube, and they'll be able to put a light inside of that. And this is a commission piece, he told me, so these are going to a specific person. And our hot shop team at the center bench, these are the people you'll usually see in the hot shop at the museum. They work here pretty much full time as glass artists. And they're just working on some pieces for the Museum of Glass store. Specifically today, they're working on some pineapple pitchers. And the pineapple name for this pitcher is just coming from the pineapple mold that they're using to get the little air bubbles across the surface of the glass. And now that they've heated up the front of this piece, Gabe is going to trim off some excess glass. You will always see them do this after they break that piece off from its original pipe. This is just going to kind of thin and straighten all of that glass out. So at the center bench, this is pretty much as far as the pitcher is going to be opened up. And now they just need to create a handle on the side of the pitcher and then create that little spout on the opposite side of the handle. And while that handle is being made, you can see the glass has cooled down quite a bit. It's not moving very much, so we need to go back into the furnace over and over again briefly to make sure that the entire piece is staying at around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer so that nothing cracks or breaks from thermal shock. So now Sarah has just come over with a small clear glass bubble, and this is attached to the lower half of the pitcher and then pulled up. So this handle is going to be hollow, I will point out. And this is going to be beneficial in just a couple of ways. Mostly the piece is going to be a little bit lighter overall instead of just having a solid, heavy glass handle on the side of this piece. And now to create this spout, they're just going to heat up a really small section of glass on the lip, just on the opposite side from the handle. We don't want the entire piece to be hot all at the same time, otherwise everything's going to be moving. So we just heat up one small area at a time for a small detail like this. Now Gabe is able to go in with a pair of tweezers and push that edge of the lip out, creating our single spout. So now this pitcher is pretty much complete. They're going to prepare to break this piece off. And for everyone who just joined, at the center bench you can see that we're currently working on making some pineapple pitchers. And I'll point out the pineapple mold in just a moment here as soon as I give you guys a little overview. But over on the right side of the hot shop, they've just finished another piece as well. Over on the right, we have Levi Belber and his team, and they're creating these really large cylinders of glass, and these will eventually be used as light fixtures. So they're going to be able to put a light inside of these and display them. And this is a commission piece. But at the center bench, these pitchers, these are actually going into the Museum of Glass store. And the people who are working on these pitchers are actually our Museum of Glass hot shop team. So they're here pretty much full time working on all of these different pieces of glass. So now to break this off, they're just going to apply a little bit of water to that connecting point. This is causing some purposeful shocking and cracking in the glass. And then all they have to do is tap the pipe, and that should break that piece cleanly off. And this is broken off and balanced so that they can torch the bottom of the piece to get rid of any leftover sharp ends that remain. And it looks like we're putting our pitchers into the top load annealer. So whenever we finish a piece, it has to go into the annealer to slowly cool down at least overnight. It's going to start at around 950 degrees Fahrenheit and then slowly cool down with the press of a button. So we'll usually use the large black boxes on the side walls, but it looks like they're saving that space for other things right now. And we're just using this top load one because we're loading it from the top. And now to point out our furnaces so you all can have an understanding of how hot things are in the hot shop. So our first furnace is this large tank with the closed door here. This is our glass furnace, and it holds up to around 1,000 pounds of clear molten glass at a pretty steady 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit. So the glass in that furnace is sitting at a steady 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can imagine it's just like a giant pot of honey. It's just this giant pool of molten glass. And so to gather that glass, all we have to do is stick our pipe in and turn, and it gathers a ball on the end, just like sticking a wooden dowel inside of a pot of honey. And then our open face furnaces at each bench, these are running between 21 and 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. So just a little bit hotter. And these are used for reheating only, I want to point out. Both those types of furnaces run off of natural gas and forced air. Natural gas, kind of like a stove at home. And then these torches run off of propane and oxygen. You'll see us use these on and off. And they run at around the same temperature as the furnace as well. So that's a pretty big question because glass has been made in many places across the world for a very, very long time. But the type of glass we use in this hot shop is called soft glass. It has a little bit of a lower melting point, and it's a little bit more fragile in some ways. You can't microwave it, you can't dishwash it. And we use a lot of Italian techniques, a lot of Italian tools, and a lot of Italian phrases for some of those tools as well. So you could say that we got our glass blowing from Italian glass blowing. So depending on the project, it's going to take various amounts of time. If it's something simple that they've made many times before, it might only take 30 minutes for each project, which is pretty short for a piece of glass. And if it's more experimental, it's something larger, then it might take 2 or 3 hours. But I would say the average amount of time for each piece is usually about an hour. So something interesting that you'll probably be able to see in just a moment here is they actually do something called a strip gather. They'll gather a large amount of clear glass onto their bubble that they already have, and then they'll hang it down and allow some of that glass to drip right off. So they kind of know beforehand how much glass they need for the project, and they can kind of feel the weight, and then depending on that, they immediately get that glass off while it's fresh and hot. And at the center bench here, Sarah is creating just a small clear bubble. And Gabe is actually working with a piece of color that started off as something called color bar, like I have in my hand here. So this is just solid colored glass, and we'll get it shipped in to use for this purpose here. This is just going to give us a really smooth, even layer of color across our entire piece. In this case, we've been going with transparent colors for all these pieces. It really allows us to see the little air bubbles that we purposefully put inside of the glass. So at the center bench, after heating that color up, they drop it onto that small clear bubble. And they're going to roll this back to completely cover that small clear bubble, creating that really smooth, even layer. And you could imagine this kind of like blowing out a balloon. So as they blow this piece out, that color is going to get thinner and thinner and become more transparent. So a lot of transparent colors start off really, really dark. It's kind of impossible to see through them when they're in their bar form, depending on the color, of course. So they have to start off rich so that they still have a good amount of color as they blow this piece out. It's going to be sandwiched in between many layers of clear. And over on the right side of the hot shop, if you can see what's going on over there, Levi is actually using a block. That's that wooden spoon-shaped tool in his hand there. And this is usually kept in water. That's what's in that bucket behind the bench. And he's going to use this to kind of smooth and even out all of that freshly gathered glass from the clear glass furnace. So sometimes we'll spray water into the furnace. You may have briefly seen that over on the right. And this is to pop any air bubbles that have come to the surface of the glass. We want to get rid of any air bubbles that we see so that they're not trapped inside of our piece later on. So now it looks like we've pretty much rolled that color back over the clear bubble over at the center bench. And once we've finished rolling that color back and creating a small bubble inside, we will let it cool down before gathering another layer of clear. Before gathering more clear, we always let the current glass we have cool down quite a bit. We don't want it to be moving. We don't want to lose the shape that we already have as we go into that hot furnace. So over on that right side of the hot shop, Levi's just gathered one more layer of clear. And he still has that very freshly hot glass on his bubble. Immediately goes over to the shards of clear glass on that table. And these are usually called frit, F-R-I-T, these little shards of colored glass. In this case, this is just clear glass. This is going to give them a texture on the surface of their piece. So we do have a fan at the top of the cone, and it's just pulling some hot air out. And then we also have some ventilation down here, kind of pushing cold air in, just trying to keep this place a little bit cooler. And this cone, I will point out, is mostly aesthetic. It's mostly just for looks. It's based off of these old wood burners we used to have along the Theophos waterway called wigwam burners or beehive burners. And these were pretty much the same shape as this cone that we're inside of, but this cone, as you can see, is tilted on its side. It gives us a lot more floor space to put our equipment. And I see a few new people in the hot shop here and there, so I just want to reintroduce our projects today again. So over on the right bench, we have someone who is renting our bench, Levi Belber. And he and his team are working on some really large cylinders of glass, and these are eventually going to be turned into light fixtures by cutting the bottom and the top of the cylinder off to create just essentially a large tube that a light can be put inside of. And the rest of the people on our hot shop floor here, these are our hot shop team members. They're here when you come in on a day that there's no visiting artists, for example. So you'll see these guys pretty frequently. And they're making some items for the Museum of Glass store today, specifically pineapple pitchers. And at the center bench, Sarah has actually just stuffed this bubble inside of our pineapple mold, hence the name Pineapple Pitchers. And could I have a picture of that mold up on the screen, please? Could I have a picture of that pineapple mold, please? All right, so I'll try to call for it later, guys. I'm just going to do my best to explain it to you. So inside of this mold, we have a bunch of inward-facing spikes. And when we push the glass inside of that mold, there we go, we have a picture of it up on the screen. This is going to create a bunch of dimples or small holes across the surface of our glass bubble. And then now we're going to gather over top of those dimples one more time, and this is going to trap air inside of each of those little pockets, creating these purposeful spaced little bubbles across our entire piece. So this is how we're getting those air bubbles inside of our pineapple pitcher. And this is all the glass that we need for this piece. It looks pretty small right now, but we're going to keep blowing it out bigger and bigger, and the glass is going to get thinner and thinner for this pitcher. And right now it's really hard to tell what the color of this glass is, I will point out. As this glass is blown bigger and it's allowed to cool down, you'll be able to see more and more of that true color later on. But right now, whenever glass is hot, it's going to glow this bright orange, kind of like lava. And then as it cools down, once again, you'll see that true color. And for anyone new who joined, I just want to remind you all that if anyone ever has any questions, please feel free to grab my attention by raising your hand. I'll come right over. So over on this right bench, Levi is using a carbon fiber pad, and this is usually stacked with newspaper as well and soaked in water to help prevent any heat from getting to you. He's using this on the side of the bubble, so as they blow into the end of the pipe, this is pushing the bubble outward and keeping it kind of pushed into a narrow shape. And then similarly, at the center bench, we're using the newspapers as well, but we're pushing the newspapers on the bottom of the bubble. So you can see this is creating a wider, kind of rounder shape of the bubble versus a narrower, longer shape like over on the right. And then to perfect the sides of this cylinder, they're going to roll it onto a wooden board. And this also has layers of newspaper on top, soaked in water, just to help prevent that wood from burning. And this is just going to apply an even pressure across the entire surface of the bubble all at the same time, perfectly straightening those walls of the cylinder. And at the center bench here, this is another way we can stretch our glass out, is by hanging the pipe down with the glass towards the floor, basically just using gravity as another one of our tools as it pulls that taffy-like glass towards the ground. And at the center bench, this tool that Gabe has been using on and off, these are the jacks, those two metal blades. And he has just carved a jack line into that glass. That's that divot kind of near the pipe. And this is where we remove this piece from the pipe later on. And I haven't really had a chance to mention this torch here yet. So this large fluffy flame, you see we have one at pretty much every bench. And these are running at around the same temperature as the furnaces, between 21 and 2300 degrees Fahrenheit. But with this torch, we can focus our heat to a specific area. So if the back end of our piece is cooling down, just as it was right now, kind of, we can heat up just the back end of the piece and kind of balance that heat back out. We want the entire piece of glass to be around 1000 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer, otherwise we can get cracking and breaking from thermal shock. And the bottom of this pitcher is complete. So we need access to the other side of the pitcher now to finish off our piece. And the way that we're going to do that is by creating a punty, which is this little clear attachment on the end of our pipe here. And this is going to be attached to the bottom of this pitcher at the center bench. Then we'll break this pitcher off from the pipe that it's currently attached to. So now they've just brought that punty over, and this is placed into the center of the bottom of this piece. And once they're happy with that connection, it's not moving around very much, all they have to do is apply some water to the jack line, which you remember is that little divot near the pipe. And this will cause some purposeful shocking and cracking in that area of the glass. Then a simple tap of the pipe breaks that piece cleanly off. So at the center bench, after heating up the front end of this piece only, Gabe is able to pull some of that glass away from the rest of the piece and then trim all of that excess glass off. That's that same glass that he pulled out, just to point out. And this is leaving us with these nice straight walls and nice thin walls. Usually when we break a piece off, it leaves a little bit of an uneven opening in the glass there. It's just a little bit thicker, so they usually perfect it by just trimming a little bit off. So over on the left, I haven't been talking about this very much because it's such a quick and kind of easy process, but they're working on some commission pieces over on the left, and this is just taking a little bit of solid glass, rolling it into some blue glass color, and then they simply drop it onto a metal table, and then cut it off, torch it to get rid of leftover sharp ends, and then they stamp it with a brass stamp. And they're just doing this over and over again, creating these little cookie-shaped glass pieces. And this has a design in it for maybe a specific company that commission those pieces. And at the center bench, I want to point out that they've opened this pitcher up to its full size already. So this is as big as it's going to get. And right now, Sarah is preparing a small clear bubble. And this is going to be attached to the side of the piece as a handle. So our handle is going to be a hollow, clear bubble in a way. And this is just going to make sure that the piece is overall a little bit lighter rather than having this solid, heavy glass on the side of the piece. We just have this really light, dainty bubble on the side of our piece. And now that we have our handle, all we have to do is create that spout on the opposite side of the handle, right on the lip, and that piece is pretty much done. So these are a pretty quick process, as you'll notice. They're able to create quite a bit of them in one day. Once again, these are going into the Museum of Glass store. I believe they said that these are our most popular item in the store. And at the center bench here, you can see that they're just using this really small handheld torch to heat up the small area of the lip that they're creating the spout. And then to create that spout, all Gabe does is push from the inside out with a pair of tweezers, and this piece is pretty much done. So now to prepare to break it off, they'll torch the back end of the piece and just get some heat back in. We want to make sure nothing is below 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And now to break this little pitcher off, all they have to do is apply some water to that small connecting point right at the end of the pipe. This is causing just a little bit of shocking and cracking in the connection, and then they tap the pipe and that breaks that piece cleanly off. Looks like that was a successful break. So this is placed onto a mat that's going to hold it upright and kind of keep it insulated. They're going to quickly torch the bottom of the piece just to get rid of any leftover sharp ends and any broken bits of glass. And then finally, they stamp it with the Museum of Glass logo. And this is brought over to our top load annealer. You usually won't see us using this, but we're using a lot of our other annealers. This is going to keep it in there at around 950 degrees Fahrenheit and then slowly cool it down with the press of a button, at least overnight, so it doesn't break from thermal shock. So we won't see it until tomorrow. And they are going to be making these over and over again. So if you miss the beginning of the process, you'll see how they apply the color and how they get those bubbles inside of the glass. And over on the right bench, it looks like they've come pretty far with their cylinder as well. Looks like they're preparing to break this piece off. Once again, these are going to become light fixtures later on. They'll be cutting the ends of this cylinder off. Now this is the annealer that we usually use. And this is, as you can see, it's loading from the side rather than the top. That's pretty much the only difference, and it's much larger, of course. Now over on the right, once again, we have Levi Belber. And he's making these large cylinders as a commission. He's going to be making 5 of those blown cylinders by hand, and then eventually you'll see him pull out a mold that he's created for this project as well. And welcome to anyone who recently joined us in the hot shop. I want to give you all a little overview as to who we have here and what's going on today. So we actually do have some visiting artists today, basically. Over on the right shop, we have Levi Belber, and that is the man who is currently holding onto that glass pipe with the small clear bubble on the end. And he and his team are making some large cylinders today. These are eventually going to be cut and used as light fixtures. So it's going to be a pretty big project. He's making 5 of these handmade, hand-blown, and then he's eventually going to move on to using a mold. And these are using a process for coloring called a color drop or color overlay, where we take a stick of color bar, kind of like this. And we heat this up and we drop it onto that clear bubble. So you'll see that process pretty soon here. So Levi's just going to hold this small clear bubble upright, and he's allowing it to cool down quite a bit. It's not going to be moving around very much. And then this color will be dropped on top. And because the clear bubble is pretty cold, this is going to allow it to maintain its shape as they roll that color back to completely cover the clear bubble. And so at the center bench, I was about to say, they are going to be doing that same process for their project as well. You can see that Gabe has that color bar on the end of his pipe there. And I want to point out a couple of furnaces as well. So you'll see us using both of our furnaces today, but this one is our glass furnace specifically, this large tank with the closed door. It holds up to around 1,000 pounds of clear molten glass, and it stays at a really steady 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit. And then our open face furnaces here, these are used for reheating only. So we'll put our glass into this furnace over and over again to make sure that it stays malleable and soft, kind of like taffy or putty. And if I didn't mention already, those stay between 21 and 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on how quickly we want to heat our glass up. And you'll eventually see us using these torches over and over again. And these are at each bench, running at around the same temperature as the furnaces. But with the torch, you can imagine we can heat up just a small area of the glass at a time, rather than the entire thing overall inside of the furnace. So once again, at the center bench, that color has been brought over, and this is dropped on top of that small clear bubble. And over on the left side of the hot shop, they're continuously working on this really large commission that they have going on, where they're just creating these little medallions over and over again. These are just little pieces of glass kind of shaped like a cookie, using a stamp with that specific commissioned pattern. And just as a little reminder for everyone, if anyone ever has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll come right over to answer your question. So this large silver box right here. So we may be using this a couple of times today, but we usually use this to heat up pieces of color. And that's just one of its more basic uses. But basically anything we put inside of that box is going to be heated up to or kept at the temperature of around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is not hot enough to melt or change the shape of that glass. It's also not cold enough to let it crack or break from thermal shock. So we'll just keep glass inside of there to either preheat it or to keep it warm as we wait on another part of the piece, for example. So at the center bench, you can see that they've completely rolled this layer of color back to completely cover up that clear bubble. And we are going to gather one more layer of clear and then eventually push this bubble inside of a mold. And this is going to be a pineapple mold. And this is giving us the name for these pitchers, which is the pineapple pitchers. I'll make sure to pull up a picture of the mold in just a bit. Actually, could I have a picture of that pineapple mold now, please? So up on the screen, you can see a picture of that pineapple mold. You can see there's a bunch of inward-facing spikes inside of this mold. So when we push that glass inside, it's going to give us a bunch of dimples or small holes across the surface of the glass. And then when we gather one more time over top of those holes, this is going to trap air inside of each of those little individual pockets, giving us these perfectly spaced bubbles across our piece. And I always like to pull up this picture of the mold just because it's really hard to see the inside of that mold as they're actually using it on the hot shop floor. Now, as you can imagine, with all of those inward-facing spikes, how do we pull the glass out if the spikes are going to be pushing inside the glass, kind of grabbing onto it? So it's a really difficult process of making sure you're not pushing it in too far or leaving it in there for too long. We have to kind of wiggle it out and go very quickly so that nothing gets stuck inside of that mold. And I have seen glass get stuck inside of these molds a couple of times. It just happens sometimes. Now, over on the right, this is really interesting. So they've just gathered one more layer of clear glass, and while that glass is nice and fresh and hot, they're starting to roll this inside of a pile of clear shards of glass called frit. And this is just going to stick to the surface of that glass. And the purpose of this is not to add color this time. This is just to add a texture across the surface of the piece, since this is just clear. So now at the center bench, Sarah's heated this glass up and is about to stuff it inside of that pineapple mold. So she pushes it inside of that mold and gives just a little puff of air before immediately pulling that glass back out. And right now it's a little bit hard to see from far away, but we do have a bunch of those little dimples across the surface of our glass. And as Sarah's using these metal tools across the glass, you could kind of hear that texture, that sound of the metal hitting each of those little ridges and bumps. And now that we have all of these little dimples across the surface of the glass, we have to let this cool down so it maintains its shape. And then eventually this will be put back inside of the clear glass just to gather one more layer of clear over top and trap air inside of those little dimples. And for anyone who recently joined, once again, we have Levi Belber over on the right side of the hot shop. That's the man sitting down at the bench. And he and his team are making these really large cylinders. These will eventually be used as light fixtures. They're going to cut the bottom and possibly the top of the cylinder off and be able to add a light inside and hang that piece of glass up as a light fixture itself. And the rest of the people on the hot shop floor, these are our hot shop team members. At the center bench, they're working on making some items for the Museum of Glass store. Specifically today, we're making pineapple pitchers because we're using a pineapple mold to get all these little air bubbles inside of the glass. Then over on the far left bench, they're doing a really large repetitive project. They're creating these little pieces of glass over and over again, little medallions using a stamp. It creates kind of like a little cookie of glass, as you can imagine. And they said that they have to make 1,000 of those. So that's going to be a pretty big process. So at the center bench here, they're working on stretching this glass out. As you can see, they hung that glass down towards the floor. This is just them using gravity as another one of their tools by stretching that glass out. And of course, you saw that large fluffy flame. I could hear all of those exclamations. This is running at around the same temperature as the furnaces themselves, between 21 and 2300 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, our torches, as you can see, they're used to heat up just a specific area of the glass at a time so we could focus extra heat in one area rather than heating up the entire thing overall inside of the furnace. And now that this glass has been blown thinner and is starting to cool down a little bit, you can see more and more of that true color coming out. Looks like this one might be a little bit of a green color almost. Sometimes it's really hard to tell when the glass is hot. So now that we've finished the bottom of our pitcher at the center bench, we need to attach a second pipe to the bottom of the piece. The second pipe that we attach is called the puntee. And the purpose of the puntee is basically to flip the orientation of the piece. We need access to the other side that's currently attached to the pipe. So once that connection is secure and they're happy with that, all they have to do is apply some water, causing some shocking and cracking, and then tap the pipe, and that breaks that piece cleanly off just at that little connection point. And of course, since this is a hollow blown piece, after breaking that off, we're left with an opening on the end. So now we just heat up that end of the piece and start to open it up. And right here, the glass is still pretty solid and that connection is still hot and moving around a little bit. So they'll bring it back and just make sure that the pipe is centered to the bottom by using a pair of tweezers to support the weight on the other end. So whenever you see them stop turning, that's them kind of letting it fall on center with the pipe. And yes, that was just a simple little broom. They were just trying to get any excess particles off the surface of the glass. If we were to leave any particles on and then continue working with the glass, as you can imagine, that could permanently keep the particles in the glass once the glass becomes taffy-like again. And it looks like we're doing the same thing over on that right bench as well. They've attached a punty to the bottom of the piece. And this one is a little bit of a different punty, I'll point out. It's more of a hollow connection. So when they break this off later on, it has less of a chance of breaking the bottom of the piece. And they tend to do this with larger pieces. And at the center bench, they've just used a pair of tweezers to pinch and pull some of the glass away from the opening of the piece. And then they're going in with a pair of shears, which are like glass scissors, and trimming off a lot of that excess glass. So after we break a piece off from its original pipe, that connecting area is usually a little bit thicker glass. It's a little bit of an uneven break. So we just want to get rid of a little bit of excess glass to kind of perfect that opening. Make sure everything is straight and even and those walls are thin. And after heating this glass up one more time, Gabe was able to go back in with that pair of jacks, those two metal blades, and open this piece up. And as far as it's opened right here, this is pretty much as far as it's going to be opened at all. They're going to leave it pretty much at that size. So now they just need to worry about creating that handle that's going to be attached to the side of this pitcher, and then creating the spout. And those are our two final steps in this process. So at the center bench, Gabe is just working on keeping this main body of our pitcher nice and warm. And Sarah's actually preparing a small clear bubble, and this is going to be attached to the side of this pitcher as our handle, which I might have already mentioned, but just in case. And having a blown handle is going to be beneficial. It's just going to make sure that the piece is a little bit lighter overall instead of just having that solid heavy glass on the side of the piece, as well as just being aesthetically pleasing, kind of dainty. So this is going to be placed onto the lower half of the piece first and then stretched up to stretch that bubble. Then when they cut that end of the bubble, this has completely trapped the air inside. And now that we have our handle, we're just going to have to create that spout on the opposite side. And the way that we're going to do this is by going in with this little torch that Gabe is using here. And this is just going to be used to heat up that really small area of the lip. Right now he's just heating up that connection point to the handle. So now they're just heating up that one small area of the lip. And once this is hot enough, Gabe was able to go on the inside of the lip and push out using a pair of tweezers, very quickly creating one small spout. And as you can imagine, we're not heating up the entire piece overall or the entire lip overall, because this would alter the entire shape of the piece itself. We just want to heat up one small area if we only want to alter that one small area. And now that they have that spout, they're just going to prepare to break this piece off. And usually before breaking a piece off, you'll see them using that large fluffy flame to torch the back end of the piece pretty frequently. And now to break this off, just like earlier, we apply some water to that connecting area, causing a little bit of shocking and cracking in the glass. And then all we have to do is tap the pipe, and that should break that piece cleanly off into those Kevlar gloves. And this is going to be placed upside down so that they can torch the bottom to get rid of any leftover sharp ends, and to also stamp it with the Museum of Glass logo. And this small torch that they're using here, you won't see them use it super frequently, but this is the hottest item in the hot shop. It can actually get up to around 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is super quickly heating up that center of the bottom and allowing them to apply that stamp. And finally, this is going into the top load annealer. Annealer is a hard word for the closed captioning system. But this is going to slowly cool that piece of glass down, at least overnight, so it doesn't crack or break from thermal shock. So we're not going to see that piece until tomorrow. And it looks like they're getting pretty close to finishing that cylinder over on the right bench as well. So you'll most likely see that same process of them preparing to break the piece off, applying a little bit of water, and then tapping the pipe. And just a reminder, if anyone ever has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll come right over. So once again, they apply that water and then tap the pipe. And this is going to be placed into the annealers that we usually use. These are those large black boxes over on the side walls. And this just does that same thing. It's going to cool it down at least overnight so it doesn't break from thermal shock. It's going to stay at a pretty steady 950 degrees Fahrenheit and then slowly tick down with the press of a button. And it looks like at the center bench, they're already getting started on that next pitcher. This is starting with a small clear bubble that Sarah has here. And Gabe has a piece of color on the end of his pipe, starting with something called color bar, much like this piece in my hand here. Just solid colored glass through and through. And they'll heat this up and then drop it onto that small clear bubble before rolling this back to completely cover that clear bubble. So over on the right side of the hot shop, they're just going to be continuing to make those cylinders that they were making earlier. And I didn't quite get a glimpse at what part of the process we're in yet, so just give me a moment here. But sometimes the glass can take on a different shape just depending on whether they're applying color or just what part of the process they're in. Oh yeah, so right here, it does look a little bit like a mushroom, but this is because they've applied that color bar, which you remember is like this. And they're working on rolling it back over the clear right now. So they're going to continue to push that down and smooth it back and out just to create that really nice smooth layer of color. And they described this color as champagne to me. Just a little tidbit of information. And welcome to everyone who just joined the hot shop or recently joined the hot shop. We have a few different things going on the hot shop floor today. I was just describing the cylinders that they're making over on that right bench there. At the center bench, we're going to be working on making some pineapple pitchers, and I'll describe why we call them pineapple pitchers in just a moment here. And then over on the left bench, they're working on a commission piece. Our hot shop team's working on a commission piece, and they said that they have to make 1,000 of these little medallions, and they've been working on them all day so far. They'll probably continue to work on them. But these are pretty simple. They're just dropping some glass onto the table and then stamping it with a brass stamp, and then they simply put it away to cool down overnight. And it looks like at the center bench and right bench, we've just pretty much finished applying our base layer of color for our two pieces. And now to describe that pineapple pitcher. So these are eventually going to go into the Museum of Glass store. I've heard that they're one of our most popular items in that store. And could I have a picture of that pineapple mold, please? So up on the screen, there's a picture of the pineapple mold. You can see that there's a bunch of these inward-facing spikes. So when we push that glass bubble into the mold, this will push those spikes into the glass, and this is going to create a bunch of dimples or small holes across the surface of our bubble. And then we simply gather one more layer of clear glass over top of this, and that clear glass is going to trap air inside of each of those individual little dimples, creating this really even pattern of bubbles like you see on the right image. So you'll see them use that mold pretty soon here, actually. They're getting the glass ready to go inside of that mold now.